Some killers don't chase chaos. They calculate it. They watch. They wait. And when the moment comes, they don't scream. They silence. These 6 didn't kill for passion or panic. They killed with purpose, with methods so specific, so clean, that by the time someone noticed, the bodies were already gone. Before I tell you how these killers lured, sliced, buried, or vanished, tell us where you're watching from and what time it is right now. And don't forget to subscribe, because in these stories, the last thing their victims heard wasn't a warning, it was a welcome. Sawyer "Frame" Knox didn't kill for thrill or impulse. He killed because success had a face, and it wasn't his. At 33, Sawyer lived alone in a third-floor walk-up packed with film textbooks, dusty DSLRs, and expired ambition. He once called himself a visionary, a future documentary legend, the next Errol Morris, according to a tweet he pinned in 2015. But 7 years after graduating from a mediocre film program, his only credits were failed grant applications and a half-finished web series about local artists that hadn't seen a viewer in 4 years. While his classmates moved on to festival circuits, Netflix deals, and slick talking heads features, Sawyer remained stuck, resentful, unnoticed, and absolutely obsessed with the people who had, in his mind, stolen the life that belonged to him. It started as stalking. He watched them speak on panels, tracked their Patreon milestones, cataloged every Instagram post where they mentioned grinding or manifesting. And with every view, he grew more convinced they were frauds, actors pretending to be auteurs. It wasn't just jealousy, it was rage disguised as critique. In his notebooks, he called them thieves of light. Then, sometime in March, he had an idea. He would pitch a new project, The Face of Talent, a self-produced documentary about rising creatives in the city. He created a fake production company called Duralight Studios, bought a .org domain, and used a free logo generator to make it seem legit. He crafted a cold email template and began reaching out to influencers, filmmakers, indie designers, people with just enough clout to have egos, but not enough to be unreachable. His tone was humble, curious, polished. He called it a mini-doc series on creative identity in urban spaces. He offered to film the interviews in his studio loft, saying he had lighting, soundproofing, and a RED camera. He didn't. His actual space was an unfinished room with 2 soft boxes, blackout curtains, and a repurposed projector screen pinned behind a salvaged director's chair. His first confirmed guest was Liana Trent, a 27-year-old short film director who'd recently been profiled by a streaming platform. Her email reply was gracious. She showed up on time. She brought her own water bottle. She even complimented his setup. What she didn't know was that Sawyer had no intention of uploading anything. His lens cap stayed on. The camera's SD card had been removed. Hidden behind the fake screen, he'd strung 48 inches of industrial-grade camera wire, thin, silent, nearly invisible unless the light hit it right. As they sat down and began recording, Sawyer asked questions that seemed insightful but increasingly invasive. Do you ever feel like your work is overrated? What would you do if no one watched your films tomorrow? How do you handle knowing you're lucky instead of good? Liana laughed nervously, said she didn't really know how to answer. And that's when Sawyer stood up, stepped behind her, and told her, "This part won't make the cut." Before she could turn around, he looped the wire over her head and pulled hard. She thrashed, but he'd already anchored one end around his gloved wrist. It took less than a minute. She collapsed in the chair, blood pooling at her clavicle where the wire cut through skin. He held her body there for another 40 seconds, watching her reflection in the blacked-out monitor. Then he lowered her to the floor, rolled up the carpet, and began cleaning. He wiped the chair, reset the screen, packed her bag, and stuffed her into a sealed Rubbermaid tote already prepped in the kitchen. That night, he loaded her into a car he'd rented using a fake ID and dumped her body in a construction trench on the city's east side, covered in lime powder and crumbled drywall. By morning, he was posting, "Thank you to our first guest," stories on a fake production account. He captioned it with, "Real artists talk real truth. Stay tuned." And no one, not her fans, not her crew, not even her parents, knew she was already gone. Sawyer Knox didn't stop after Liana. In his mind, she was just the rough cut, a test scene. After that first kill, something flipped. Not guilt, not fear, control. He finally had what no job, grant, or interview had given him, a narrative he owned. And once he tasted that power, the edits got cleaner. Over the next 4 months, he reached out to 4 more creators, all rising, all confident, all people who had rejected, ghosted, or outpaced him in the creative scene. He lured each one with the same pitch, a profile piece on young voices in forgotten cities. He told one of them, a muralist, that his channel had 70,000 subscribers. He told another she had the perfect voice for VO. They all said yes. None of them left. Each time, the setup stayed the same. Wire hidden behind a screen, dead camera, lights angled to erase shadows, soft music playing through an old laptop. His technique became more precise. With the second victim, he adjusted the tension for a cleaner drop. With the third, he used earplugs to drown out the sound. He wrapped each body in painter's plastic, buried them in rented lots, and returned home to post vague stories about another amazing interview in the can. He even used stock audio to make it sound like a real podcast teaser. His kill count hit 5, and for a moment, he believed he had created something no one could critique, a masterpiece of silence. But his final mistake was logistical, not emotional. Victim number 5 was a dancer named Jules, and she brought a personal assistant to the meeting, a last-minute addition. Sawyer panicked, said the studio was too small for 2, and rescheduled. Jules never showed, but the assistant remembered the address. 2 weeks later, after Jules was reported missing, the assistant passed that detail to investigators. That cracked the door. Detectives found Sawyer's alias tied to a burner email used to rent the building. A subpoena revealed surveillance footage from a nearby cafe. Sawyer seen hauling plastic bins from the building twice in the same week, wearing gloves despite the heat. When police entered the unit, they found the setup intact. Light stands, blood traces under the floor tiles, and in the closet, a stack of labeled SD cards. Each was marked "Final Cut." What they found on them wasn't footage. It was sound, not screams, but breathing, struggling, gurgling. He had recorded the audio of every kill, no visuals, just the final minutes, as if that's all he needed. When they found him, he was sitting in a co-working cafe, editing a thumbnail for a YouTube banner he never launched. The file on his screen read, "Cut the noise PSD." He was arrested without resistance. At trial, he pled not guilty, claimed all audio was art, that no bodies existed. But the burial sites matched the timeline, the wire matched the marks, and the victims were real. The jury took less than 5 hours. Life without parole. His name was scrubbed from every alumni list. But online, some circles began calling him the editor. A subreddit popped up with his logo, just a mute icon on black. His channel was never real, but now his myth is. And every time a young creator disappears, someone reposts his quote from an unreleased script he left behind. "They watched me disappear for years. Now they know how it feels." Sawyer killed to control the narrative. But the next man didn't need an audience. He needed silence. Where one killer staged a documentary, this one erased entire families, quietly, cleanly, and by the time anyone realized what was missing, it was too late to stop what had already vanished. Darius, the quiet tenant. Mercer didn't look like a threat, he looked like help. A quiet man in his late 40s with a neutral face, clean work boots, and a knack for carrying groceries that weren't his. Landlords called him reliable. Tenants called him invisible. He didn't own any property, but he lived in over a dozen homes in 5 years, always as a temporary caretaker, always paying cash, always fixing things that didn't seem broken. He moved through duplexes, rural rentals, subsidized homes just outside city limits. And with each new address, he looked for the same thing: a tired family, single moms, broken locks, distant fathers, quiet kids. He didn't want attention. He wanted silence. He started with offers: free help, no charge, patch a window, replace a hinge. He brought groceries unasked, paid a month of gas in advance. And then, when trust was soft enough to lean on, he made the move. If rent ever becomes a problem, I know a few ways to make it easier. That line always landed. Nobody ever asked what it meant. The first time he killed, it wasn't planned. A young mother named Beth had asked him to fix a mold problem in her bathroom. He showed up with tools and a freezer chest. She let him in. Her 2 kids played in the living room. 30 minutes later, she was gagged, taped, and dead inside a plastic-wrapped crate in the basement. The kids never screamed. They said Darius told them she needed to rest and that they'd see her soon. They never did. Within 2 hours, he packed up his gear, moved the kids into a back bedroom, and called CPS using a fake name, claiming there was neglect and no adult present. When social workers arrived, the home was clean. Darius was gone. The children were taken into foster care. The case was closed as abandonment. Beth's body was never found, and Darius repeated the pattern, house by house, state by state. He killed quietly, cleanly, and left no blood. His weapon of choice was suffocation, thick duct tape wrapped around the face, layered until breath disappeared. He stored the bodies in deep freezers he purchased secondhand, sometimes buried beneath bags of meat, sometimes sealed inside, never plugged in. Every time he left a home, he donated the fridge to a rural recycling co-op, a fake number that routed to a voicemail he never checked. He stayed one step ahead, until one family fought back. Darius Mercer's final disappearance began in Unit B of a crumbling triplex outside Columbus, Ohio. He'd moved in under the name Don March, hired by the property owner to help transition tenants while renovations happened, meaning quiet evictions, weekend patch jobs, and just enough charm to keep people from asking too many questions. In Unit B lived a single mother named Elise, her 7-year-old son Jacob, and Elise's wheelchair-bound father. The unit smelled of burnt rice and discount detergent. The plumbing knocked, the porch tilted. In other words, it was perfect. Darius offered to help immediately, replaced the porch light, repaired the lock, brought over a used space heater. Elise was grateful. Jacob was curious. Darius kept his routine clean. No loud noises, no overnight tools, no sudden entries. But by week 3, Elise had stopped returning her sister's calls. Jacob stopped going to school. Elise told the landlord she was sick and that her dad had fallen again. But what the landlord didn't know was that Elise had been dead for 6 days, suffocated with thick black duct tape and left sealed inside a plastic-lined tool chest in the basement's furnace closet. Her father, too weak to move, had died 2 days later from dehydration. And Jacob, he was still alive. Darius hadn't decided what to do with him. The boy followed him around like a stray, ate the food he brought, colored on loose drywall scraps. But it was Jacob who ended everything. He drew a picture. It was meant to be a thank you card, a crayon image of Darius standing beside a freezer. Inside the freezer were people. One had red on their face, another was labeled Mommy. Jacob gave it to a postman during a food delivery drop. The postman handed it to his supervisor, who handed it to police. Within 48 hours, detectives entered Unit B with a wellness check warrant. They found Jacob asleep in the basement, curled on a mattress beside an unplugged deep freezer. Elise's body was inside. Her father's was slumped against a tipped water heater. Darius was gone, all tools missing, his prints wiped. The landlord hadn't seen him in 4 days. But behind the drywall in the basement, officers found something else, a list carved into the studs with a chisel. It wasn't names, it was dates, 16 of them, each one lining up with a prior rental Darius had stayed in across Pennsylvania, Michigan, Ohio, and Indiana. Every date matched a missing person or family abandonment report. Some homes had been demolished, others had new tenants. But the cold trail turned warm. Authorities reopened cases. In a condemned house in Erie, they found 2 sealed freezers behind a bricked-over basement wall. In Detroit, a rusted fridge dumped in an alley tested positive for human blood. Darius had vanished, but the trail he left was frozen, layered, and methodical. The FBI now considers him responsible for 19 deaths. Jacob was placed in protective custody. When asked why he gave the drawing to the postman, he said, "Because the man in the picture didn't blink." That detail, so small, so strange, is the only thing left of Darius's face. Because to this day, no known photograph of him exists. Only descriptions, only silence, only the echo of a man who moved through homes like a whisper and left nothing but cold behind. Darius killed quietly, but the next one did it loud, not with sound, with fire. He didn't stalk his victims, he summoned them. And once they stepped inside his world, all it took was a single click to turn everything they loved into smoke. Emmett Vale didn't scream. He smoldered. A soft-spoken man in his early 40s with wire-frame glasses and hands that always smelled faintly of copper. Emmett wasn't the kind of person you noticed in a room, but if you needed something fixed, rewired, or repurposed, Emmett would offer help before you could ask. In a world full of loud tech bros and YouTube how-tos, Emmett kept to garages, repair forums, and 90s electronics manuals. He was a self-taught electrical savant, the kind who salvaged broken microwaves just to harvest the capacitors, the kind who rebuilt generators for fun. But while Emmett's hands were always busy, his mind kept returning to the same heat: rejection. It started with his brother, a man Emmett once idolized, who later cut him out of the family business, saying Emmett just doesn't connect with people. That sentence stayed with him. Over time, more doors closed. Clients ghosted him, co-workers ignored his input, neighbors waved but never remembered his name. So he stopped offering and started watching. The first project wasn't a kill, it was a message. A small garage fire in a vacant rental home, triggered by a handmade circuit that overloaded once the breaker flipped. The garage was where the new tenant had moved Emmett's old tool cabinet. No one was hurt, but the flames were precise. They only scorched what Emmett had once built. He stood across the street and watched it flicker like a candle. That was the moment he felt calm, controlled. For the first time, he realized he didn't need people to remember him. He needed them to regret forgetting him. And that's when the fires became personal. By the time the third fire went up, Emmett Vale had become something else entirely. Not a technician, not a repairman, a remover. He didn't kill with flame, he erased. Victim by victim, address by address, Emmett built a network of disappearing acts masked as electrical faults, outdated outlets, and spontaneous garage failures. But every burn had a reason, each one tied to someone who dismissed, ignored, or replaced him. He wasn't reckless, he was ritualistic. He only chose targets who forgot him. A manager who rewrote his wiring specs and took credit. A teacher who once said, "You think in circuits, not stories." A neighbor who once said they'd recommend him for a job, and didn't. He logged their names in a black notebook under the column ignored. And then, one by one, he returned. not for revenge, but for removal. His devices were built from things nobody noticed. Phone chargers rewired to short-circuit under current stress, electric air fresheners modified with nichrome loops, garage door sensors tied to delay relays that triggered heat coils once motion was detected. He never used accelerants, never broke in. He was always invited. His cover was airtight, freelance handyman offering energy-efficient retrofits. Most clients never even paid him. He insisted it was part of a portfolio build. And that's what let him in. After the work was done, he'd leave behind a smile, a card with no number, and a hidden rig behind drywall or inside the outlet faceplate. Then, sometimes days later, sometimes weeks, the fire would begin. Always small. Always in the same room where they forgot him. One died of smoke inhalation, trapped by a melting hallway floor. Another's home burned while they were on vacation, an entire digital archive of their life erased. In one case, the victim survived, barely. The fire was ruled an accident. But the survivor reported a strange moment weeks before, a man who fixed her thermostat and said, "Don't forget to remember me." That quote ended up in a local arson report, but it meant nothing until the camera surfaced. Emmett Vale's downfall came from the one thing he trusted more than fire: footage. He had always filmed his installations, not to boast, but to review. He liked seeing how clean his hands moved, how precise the wires lay flat. He didn't post anything. He didn't even edit. He just cataloged. And in April of that year, while rewiring a small motion-activated heating coil into the garage outlet of a retired dentist's home, he accidentally left a GoPro memory card behind. It had fallen behind a broken tool shelf, wedged between a wall panel and a rubber grip clamp. The homeowner never knew it was there, not until the fire. When the garage went up 3 weeks later, investigators did a standard post-burn sweep and recovered melted electronics. One of them was the clamp, fused to a corner chip of the micro SD card. Shockingly, the card still worked, and what it showed changed everything. The footage was uncut, time-stamped, and eerily quiet. No music, no narration. Just Emmett's hands methodically wiring copper into a relay switch, attaching sensors to a plastic box, and whispering a checklist to himself. Heat trigger, delay, switch, breath. The moment that line hit evidence lockers, arson investigators from 3 other states were called in. They had all seen the same burn pattern: slow ignition from garage-level circuitry, no accelerants, no forced entry, no motive. But now they had a voice. And then came the pattern. A patch of each home had a signature outlet panel, one Emmett had custom printed through a third-party seller using a design he thought was generic, a tiny etched lightning bolt inside the screw casing. One officer caught it. That symbol tied 5 fires together across state lines. Once connected, it didn't take long. Investigators followed financial records for bulk wiring supplies bought under the alias Edward Vale. One address popped, a warehouse unit registered to a defunct electronics recycling company. Inside were binders of wiring diagrams, hundreds of hand-labeled outlet panels, and 36 notebooks. One notebook held only names, victims, and the dates of the installations. Emmett's name was flagged. A traffic cam caught him leaving a hardware store 12 miles from the fire site. The arrest came 2 days later in the parking lot of a junkyard. He didn't resist. He didn't speak. When asked why he did it, he wrote only 2 words on a lined sheet of yellow paper: "You remembered." He was found guilty of 8 counts of arson and 4 counts of manslaughter. The rest were ruled unprovable. In court, he never apologized, never asked for leniency. He watched the playback of his footage like a film director watching dailies. No reaction, no pride, just study. He was sentenced to life without parole. But the digital world still loops his GoPro videos. One video essay called him the electrician of vengeance. Another called him a man who made silence burn. And somewhere in a cold evidence vault, a final SD card remains unplayed, unlabeled, unclaimed, still intact, with one note attached to the sleeve. Only light can erase what was forgotten. Emmett erased with fire, but the next killer erased with charm. He didn't threaten, he didn't chase. He made you feel seen, right before he made you disappear. Because when you're lonely, and someone finally listens, you don't notice the lock click behind you. Jacob Listener Fields never raised his voice. He didn't have to. He spoke like a therapist, dressed like a librarian, and sat with the kind of posture that made people confess things they never said out loud. He had no formal license, no academic degree, just a printed certificate from an online trauma peer support program and a Craigslist ad that read, "Private listening space for the grieving, no judgment, just quiet." He rented a basement studio beneath an old bakery. It had one couch, 2 lamps, a kettle, and soft rugs to muffle the silence. No cameras, no clocks, no mirrors. His sessions were free. He told people they could pay if they wanted, but "Payment isn't why I'm here." That line disarmed everyone. He called the space the room. Most people who came were dealing with something raw: loss of a parent, end of a marriage, a sudden diagnosis. He let them cry, let them talk. He handed out tissue and silence. And over time, his regulars formed a pattern. Mostly women, mostly isolated, often ignored by other systems. He would say things like, "You don't need a solution, you just need to be heard." But what he never said was what he believed, that some people carried emotional rot, a kind of weight that poisoned everyone around them. And in his mind, the kindest thing he could do was stop it from spreading. His first victim was a woman named Sasha, who lost her daughter in a drunk driving accident. She came every Wednesday. She brought muffins. Jacob made tea. He always served hers with a little extra honey. On her 4th visit, she didn't wake up. He told paramedics she had a seizure. Toxicology said it was fentanyl mixed with valerian root and crushed antihistamines. They ruled it accidental, possibly self-inflicted. Jacob cried at her vigil, hugged her brother, said she was just starting to feel light again. That's what he wrote in the notebook later found in the locked cabinet behind the couch. Her entry read, 04, grief pattern unresolvable. Rot confirmed, released kindly. Jacob Fields didn't call what he did murder, he called it release. In his private notebook, each victim had an entry, never by name, always by code. 06, internal static. 09, spectral fatigue. 13, sadness under glass. Each entry ended with the phrase, "Rot confirmed, released kindly." In his view, he wasn't ending lives, he was ending burdens, quietly, gently, one teacup at a time. He began experimenting with blends, herbal relaxants layered with subtle compounds, benzodiazepine dust, crushed sleep aids, essential oils used for masking, and trace amounts of synthetic opioids diluted just below the detectable thresholds. His process was ritualistic. Sessions always ended the same: a final cup of tea, silence, soft music, then a moment of stillness. If the person became drowsy, he would guide them to recline. Most passed out peacefully, some convulsed. But he stayed calm. He always cleaned, repackaged their bags, turned off their phones, and waited. Then, after 30 minutes, he would call paramedics using a prepaid burner and report a guest who fainted. By the time responders arrived, he had slipped out the back stairwell, wearing gloves, his face never caught on the bakery's broken exterior camera. None of the victims had signs of trauma. Most were cremated quickly. Their families told it was an accidental interaction with medication or stress. He even attended some memorials, hugged strangers, said, "She just needed one more good day." No one questioned the grief counselor. No one questioned the man who sat so still. And by the time a coroner began noticing patterns in the toxicology, trace compounds repeated across 3 unrelated deaths, Jacob had already moved on to his 14th client. The last session Jacob Fields ever hosted didn't start any differently. The client was a 32-year-old woman named Claire, whose sister had passed away from cancer 8 months earlier. Claire was isolated, soft-spoken, and emotionally cracked open from months of grief and silence. Jacob welcomed her gently, offered the same tea, the same pillow, the same script. What he didn't know was that Claire's friend Tessa had insisted on walking her to the appointment. And when Claire didn't respond to a check-in text 30 minutes into the session, Tessa doubled back. But instead of knocking, she turned on her phone and began recording. Tessa live-streamed everything: the soundproof door, the dark stairwell, the waiting area with no receptionist. When she pushed open the basement door, the camera caught Jacob mid-sentence, seated beside Claire, who was barely conscious. The teacup was tipped. Her breathing was shallow. Jacob didn't panic. He stood calmly and said, "Please turn that off." Tessa ran. The stream captured Jacob's face for exactly 6 seconds, the only known footage of him ever taken. It went viral before paramedics arrived. Claire survived. Police raided the basement studio that night. Inside, they found 13 identical teacups, 4 burner phones, 5 vials of chemical compounds, and a notebook with the title Field Notes, Listener Methodology. Inside were 16 coded entries. Each detailed a session, a cause, a compound. But the last page broke the pattern. It was written directly to someone. To the one who came in uninvited, "You broke the silence. Now the world will have to hear it." Jacob was arrested 2 days later at a bus station. He was wearing beige. He said nothing. During trial, he refused to speak. The court played the live stream 3 times. He was convicted on 6 counts of manslaughter and attempted murder. He is currently serving 40 years. But online, his case lives in whispers, in podcasts about soft killers, in forums about death by therapy, in Reddit threads titled, "Do You Trust Your Healer?" And while the basement has since been remodeled, one wall still bears the ghost outline of a couch, a place where strangers sat to be heard, and some were never heard from again. Jacob offered peace and delivered silence. But the next man promised speed. He didn't ask you to talk. He asked you to run. And when you did, when your shoes hit pavement and your pulse climbed, that's when he decided whether you deserved to keep breathing. Colt Winslow believed weakness was a disease, and the cure, in his mind, was pain. Not immediate pain. Sustained, earned pain. The kind that only showed up after the 8th mile, the 3rd hill, the 43rd minute of silence between breaths. A former ultra-marathoner turned amateur trail coach, Colt pitched himself as a discipline specialist. His clients came from local running forums, grief meetups, addiction support circles, anyone looking to run through it instead of talk about it. He didn't charge money. He said coaching was his therapy. What he didn't say was that each run was a test, a hunt. And if you failed the test, if you cried, if you asked to slow down, if you said, "I can't," then in his eyes, you didn't deserve to finish. His first victim was a 29-year-old man named Reed, who had recently lost his brother. He'd posted in a trauma forum asking about fitness as a way to manage grief. Colt replied within an hour. They met the next morning at a state park trail. 5 miles in, Reed said he was dizzy. Colt told him, "That's the rot leaving your body." 6 miles in, Reed collapsed. Colt knelt beside him, waited, and said, "This is your moment to rise or quit." Reed tried to stand, and that's when Colt used a flat stone to strike him once, cleanly, behind the ear. He arranged the body on the trail with water spilled beside it. The coroner ruled it heat stroke. Colt never mentioned the run. He posted afterward, "One less coward, more trail for the strong." It got 6 likes and 2 more sign-ups. Colt Winslow didn't hunt in the woods. He waited for people to bring themselves there, desperate, grieving, gasping for discipline. Over the next 14 months, he coached more than 30 people. Most survived, 4 didn't. That, he claimed later, was the ratio that proved the system worked. Every run was part physical test, part psychological interview. He asked no questions, but studied everything: stride consistency, eye contact, how often someone apologized for slowing down. He believed those who apologized were already drowning, that verbal hesitation was proof of spiritual decay. His targets were people on the edge of recovery: a teacher recovering from divorce, a firefighter after medical retirement, a woman recently diagnosed with PTSD. He praised them to their face, but in his notes, he wrote code words: half flame, stall runner, excuse pattern. When the decision was made, he modified the route, always uphill near the final mile. There, he would either encourage them to push beyond the limit, then wait for collapse, or he would say nothing and simply walk behind them. One died from a fall, one from severe dehydration. The coroner never suspected homicide. But what Colt didn't know was that several of his clients wore smartwatches. One of them, the PTSD survivor, had her device auto-synced to cloud storage after each workout, and on her final run, it recorded a voice log. 3 phrases repeated in Colt's voice: "Keep going, this is how we purge," and finally, "If you stop, I stop you." That log was never heard, until the day she didn't return. Colt Winslow's final run didn't end with a death. It began with one. When his last trainee, a 34-year-old woman named Rhea, didn't return home after her sunrise session, her smartwatch auto-synced to a family-shared cloud. Her sister accessed the workout file looking for GPS coordinates. What she found was worse: a full audio recording. It captured the first 48 minutes of the run: small talk, encouragement, breathing. But around minute 49, Colt's tone changed. "Let's see if the fire's real this time," he said. "Push, don't speak, don't fail." Then silence, then struggle, Rhea breathing erratically, a thud, and a low whisper from Colt: "Stay down if you're not ready." That audio was sent to police within an hour. Rangers found Rhea alive, unconscious, curled in a patch of dead leaves near the edge of a trail canyon. She had bruising consistent with impact, not a fall, but a shove. By nightfall, Colt's name was flagged in 3 other unresolved trail deaths. The FBI raided his storage unit and found his journals. Inside were entries for every runner, not times or pace, but phrases like "winds early," "doesn't honor pain," "should be stopped." Next to 4 names were single underlined words: "cleared." When asked to explain the term, Colt simply said, "They were purged." In court, he showed no emotion. He was convicted of 2 counts of manslaughter, 2 counts of negligent homicide, and 1 attempted murder. Sentenced to 45 years. But runners still debate his methods online. Some blame his victims. Others post his phrases as training motivation. One subreddit called r/pace protocol believes his actions were an extreme form of psychological filtration. And every time a solo runner disappears near a state park, someone reposts the audio clip's final words, a breathless whisper from Colt's voice: "The trail always tells the truth." Colt punished weakness with pain. But the next one didn't punish. He deleted. He didn't chase you. He opened a folder, read your name, and decided if the world still needed to know you existed. Because some killers take your life. Theo took your legacy. Theo, the archivist. Barrett believed that not everyone deserved to be remembered, and that forgetting, when done intentionally, was a form of mercy. Tall, soft-spoken, and always surrounded by stacks of papers, Theo spent most of his adult life posing as a public records technician, bouncing between municipal buildings, town halls, and grant-funded preservation offices. His fake credentials were impeccable. Laminated IDs, forged degrees, scanned recommendation letters signed by real dead people. He specialized in digital scanning of community heritage materials, which meant he knocked on doors with a badge and asked to digitize photo albums, school awards, old letters, anything families wanted preserved. What they didn't know was that Theo wasn't preserving anything. He was deleting, quietly, carefully, one household at a time. His obsession wasn't fame or revenge, it was control over memory. He believed some people, the loud ones, the bitter ones, the self-absorbed, were cluttering the historical record. He called them narrative noise. His first target was a retired librarian named Myra, who had spent decades archiving her town's genealogy. She welcomed him in. She offered cookies. She showed him a hallway lined with framed documents. Theo smiled, scanned a few, then asked if he could record a short oral history in her voice. She agreed. What she didn't know was that the microphone was also laced with vaporized sedatives. She passed out mid-sentence. Theo suffocated her using archival plastic wrap, a nod, he would later write, to history sealing its own envelope. Her death was ruled natural. Her archive, deleted page by page. Her digital backups, erased using recovery-blocking overwrites. Her obituary never ran, and Theo crossed her name off the list, a list he called the unrecordables. Theo Barrett didn't break into homes, he was welcomed. By the time he was onto his fourth household, he had refined the routine into a ritual: one phone call, one clipboard, one badge, and a promise. We're preserving overlooked family voices for the municipal archive. That line opened every door. Most of his victims were older, people with boxes of photos in closets, newspaper clippings under plastic, school medals taped into scrapbooks. Theo studied their collections the way most people study maps, for paths, for weaknesses, for excess. He didn't want people who had nothing. He wanted people who had too much, those who left paper trails. One woman had written 236 letters to her son in prison. Another had maintained a weekly column in a small-town church bulletin for 31 years. Another had saved every bank receipt since 1974. Theo found them all excessive. Noise. He didn't see history. He saw hoarding. So he scheduled interviews that doubled as staged preservation sessions. He'd scan their collections, then slowly isolate the most vulnerable moment: the late afternoon nap, the third trip to the bathroom, the moment when the kettle steamed and no one looked up. That's when he acted. A sedative in the tea, a sealed room, plastic gloves, always suffocation, no blood, no marks, just stillness. Then he'd wipe their digital files, shred the hard copies, wipe all secondary backups if found, and donate any blank archive boxes to a nearby library. A cruel signature gesture. One family, a retired couple and their adult daughter, were all erased in a weekend visit. The obituary was never submitted. The landlord assumed they'd moved to care homes, and Theo added 3 more check marks to a list he never showed anyone. But in his methodical purge, he made one oversight. He missed a single VHS tape. Theo Barrett's precision failed not because of what he deleted, but because of what he missed. In the basement of the Petrowski family home, his 6th target, a household of 3 generations, he had carefully scanned and erased over 800 items: photo albums, war medals, vinyl recordings, handwritten journals, even the family dog's vaccination records. He logged it all as noise level 9, multi-lineage overreach. Each item was numbered, scanned, wiped. But on the final night of his visit, with the family asleep and tea already served, He missed a single box beneath a broken floorboard, a 1991 VHS cassette labeled "Mom Sings Happy Birthday, Don't Erase." He never saw it. Days later, a contractor hired to renovate the house found the tape and played it out of curiosity. The footage was simple: a child's birthday party, off-key singing, laughter. But 2 frames at the end caught the contractor's eye. A shot of the basement hallway with Theo's face reflected in the microwave glass, time-stamped 3 hours after the family was supposedly relocated for preservation. Suspicious, the contractor turned the tape over to police. Within 48 hours, Theo's credentials were re-examined. None checked out. The office he claimed to work for had no record of him. When officers arrived at his residence, they found it silent, dark, and organized with surgical perfection. Inside, dozens of boxes of cleansed files, each marked with coded phrases like "legacy nullified," "echo folded," and "narrative erased." In one locked drawer, they found a ledger. 48 entries, each with 3 columns, a date, a phrase, and a status. The last page was freshly written in black ink. It said, "Some lives are stories, some are static. My role was never to judge, only to decide what stays." Theo was arrested walking out of a microfilm archive 2 towns over, carrying a folder labeled "Final Passages." He didn't resist. When asked for a statement, he said nothing. But in his left hand, he carried a single index card with 3 words: "Silence is mercy." At trial, prosecutors linked him to 12 disappearances. Only 6 bodies were found. The rest were presumed erased, their histories lost, their records unrecoverable. The court called it a crime against legacy. The media called him the quietest serial killer in America. Theo never argued. He simply asked for a single box to be buried with him, a blank archive carton with a sealed lid. It was denied. He was sentenced to 5 consecutive life terms without parole. But archivists still whisper his name. In some libraries, a few scan technicians now double-check old VHS tapes before disposal, just in case. And across forgotten records, a phrase has begun to reappear in permanent marker: "Do not erase." Some killers chase, some watch, some listen until you forget they're even there. And then they erase you, not just from life, but from memory. No screams, no struggle, just absence. They didn't want your money, they wanted your silence. And in the end, the world kept turning. But the spaces these people left behind, they were never filled again.